Hey everyone, I'm Amanda and this is Mommy's Reading Chair. January is done and I first off can't believe it, and I'm probably going to say that every month because I swear time flies so fast. This month I had a little bit of an unlucky start with my Disney Chooses My TBR game. If you haven't watched the January TBR, I have it linked below so you can see what I'm talking about. But essentially, I draw cards out of a bucket, and each card has a Disney character, which then corresponds with a category that makes sense for that character. And I drew an uncategorized character, which means that I had an extra book this month. Typically, I plan to read 5 books per month, but this month I had that 6th, and I really thought, oh my gosh, I'm not going to have time. January is a really busy month, but I did it. Not only that, I did it, and I had a couple of days to spare, so that made me really happy. So here's what I read. I pulled the cards in a specific order, but I did not read the books in the order of the cards that I drew. I read them in an order that made more sense for me. So the first one I started with actually was not a card drawn. It was my book club pick. And I picked this one first to read because my book club meeting in January was a little bit earlier in the month. So I wanted to make sure that I had that read with plenty of time to spare. And that was This Is How It Always Is by Laurie Frankel. This book I also featured in my most recent 10 books that really surprised me or that were really surprisingly good. So I guess that kind of spoils my review. This book was surprisingly good. I didn't necessarily think I wasn't gonna like it, but I didn't think I'd like it as much as I did. This one was on my TBR already, I've been wanting to read it, but it wasn't on my, oh my gosh, I have to drop everything and read this right away. But I really enjoyed it. It's not necessarily super long, but the text is really small, so I felt like it was going to take me a while to get through. I was wrong. I breezed through it in a few days, and I just fell in love with this family. This book follows a family with a very specific problem. They have 5 sons, but their 5th son, Claude, is very much and very obviously transgender. And this could have been handled in a multitude of ways by the author. This is a very relevant issue, is that they didn't want people to know. And I think the biggest issue this book brings forward is that it wasn't that they didn't accept their child. That the family was very loving and they loved Claude, who then became Poppy. They really supported her and her life, and they just loved her dearly, but they didn't want the world to know. They weren't ready for the world to know. And that, I think, is so relevant to right now because there are so many people who are not as accepting as this person's family. So I have to applaud the author. I think she handled this topic very well. I fell in love with every member of this family. All 5 children in this story, the 4 older brothers just were so loving and so supportive. And Poppy herself, the whole story, she was always herself, even when she was confused. And I loved that. I think this book also had a big impact on me as a new mom. The parent's point of view is the perspective you have for the majority of this book. So I think that that's why it impacted me so much, is the fact that these parents literally would do anything to ensure their child's happiness. And that's really how it is. You really would do anything. And I know my kids are only 5 months old and 3 years old, but I already feel that. I already felt that so much reading this book. I do have a couple of quotes that were really impactful. I have them in my phone. The first quote I have, when I was reading the book, I literally stopped got up out of bed and went and read this to my husband because it's so, so true. It's a little bit of a long quote, but this is exactly why the book was titled This Is How It Always Is. This is the quote from that includes the title. And it says, "This is how it always is. You have to make these huge decisions on behalf of your child, this tiny human whose fate and future is entirely in your hands, who trusts you to know what's good and right and then to be able to make that happen. You never have enough information. You don't get to see the future. And if you screw up, if with your incomplete, contradictory information you make the wrong call, nothing less than your child's entire future and happiness is at stake. It's impossible, it's heartbreaking, it's maddening, but there's no alternative." That stopped me in my tracks. And I'm thinking, I know that feeling. Like from small decisions like what shoes are my kids gonna wear today, like those decisions you actually have to think about. It's crazy. But in this case, because they have these huge decisions to make for their child, I mean, I can't even imagine. And then probably my favorite quote from the book is, "I wish for my child, for all our children, a world where they can be who they are and become their most loved, blessed, appreciated selves." I love it. I loved this book. One thing that I also really liked was the author's note at the end, which I don't always read, but I did read this one. And the author does have a child who is transgender. And one of the things that she mentioned was how she didn't write this book from the perspective of the transgender child. She wrote the book from the perspective of a parent. And her reasoning for that was Claude's story, Poppy's story, was not my story to tell. The mom's story is the story I can tell. And I loved that. That's going to stick with me for a really long time. I'm really glad that I read the author's note because, again, I don't always do that. Overall, I gave this book a 4.5 out of 5 stars. I don't know if I can give 4.5. I totally am. It wasn't the most... There was something missing for it to be pushed into that 5, but I highly recommend this book, especially to moms and parents or anyone. I just think it's such an important topic. So highly recommend. Loved it. This Is How It Always Is by Laurie Frankel. The next book that I read was The Art of Racing in the Rain by Garth Stein. This book has been recommended to me quite literally dozens of times, and I don't know why I waited so long reading it because it was amazing. I read it in 2 days. It's a short book, just over 300 pages, I believe. And I swear, like on the pages, there's so much like dead space and the text is really big. So I flew through it and I could not put it down. I definitely can see the hype around this book. I hadn't seen the movie. I really didn't know anything about it. I didn't even realize that the title came from like race car driving. Like I didn't even know that. I knew nothing. Except that it is really hyped up and supposedly a really good book, which I 100% agree with. This story is actually told from the perspective of a dog, and I don't always like books like that. I read A Dog's Purpose, and I was unimpressed with A Dog's Purpose. So maybe I just kind of had a bad taste in my mouth from a previous experience. But this book was so good. And I really think that the author did a good job with explaining why this dog knows so much and how this dog is a unique dog to be able to tell this story. The dog is the pet of a character named Dennis or Denny. And it follows Denny's life. He's a race car driver, and in the beginning, it starts with Denny and Enzo, the dog, and that's it. And of course, Denny meets a woman, they fall in love, they get married, and they have a child. And through all of this, the dog is always there, of course, and telling this wonderful story. And then the wife becomes very ill. I hate her parents so much for all of the crap they put Denny through. I won't get into what crap that is, but Enzo has such a unique perspective because of course he is going to love Denny regardless of what happens because it's his person, it's his man, it's his master. Like he loves Denny and he then loves his daughter, and just all of the hell the grandparents put Denny through during the time that his wife was ill just sickens me. But I couldn't put it down, and I can tell you that the ending is a happy ending, and I will definitely be watching the movie, which I don't usually say. I usually say I will stay away from the movie, but the movie actually has been highly recommended to me as well, and says that most people say that it follows the book fairly well, so I think I am going to give the movie a try. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. I adored it. And I'm so happy that my first month this year, I got a 5-star book. So happy. That was a pet card, and I had 2 of them. We'll say that that was the Dalmatian card. It had to have a pet on the cover. So The Art of Racing in the Rain by Garth Stein. After that, I read MODOK by Ralph Helfer. This was another animal book. I drew the Simba card, which needs to have an animal on the cover, and this book's been kind of burning a hole in my shelf. I've been wanting to read it for a long time, and I just never picked it up. It's a fairly short book, but it actually was not a quick read for me. Any book following a 5-star book for me has a lot to live up to, and although I did wind up enjoying this book, I had a hard time getting into it. I had to remind myself constantly that the author of this book is not known for being an author. He's known for being an animal trainer. So even though he's written several books at this point all about animals, he's not a strong author in my humble opinion. The beginning of the book, maybe even like the first third of the book, which is actually kind of a lot, the timeline was very difficult for me to follow. There's a lot of jumps in, there would be a paragraph, not even a separate chapter, a paragraph, and then the next paragraph would be 3 years later. And I had a hard time following that in the beginning. And then once the timing and the timeline and the sequencing of the story started to become a little bit flow a little bit better, then I really got into the story, and I wound up really liking the end. I love MODOK. That elephant is just the story is so heartwarming to have that connection with an animal. I love stories like that, and I also loved the story because it is based off of a true story, which is even better. One note that I had about it, and I actually have it right here in front of me, is the author's note in the beginning. Look at me, I'm reading all the author's notes now. I'm so proud of myself. But the author's note says, "The story of MODOK is true. When writers attempt to write a story based on the truth, they must first take all that they themselves have seen and know it to be a fact. Next comes research and documented proof which may or may not be true. And finally, there's hearsay. That which people tell you is factual. All this is put in a bowl, mashed and ground, and spread onto the pages in as close a semblance as possible. Then a little poetic, political license is taken. Therefore, the story of MODOK is true, at least as far as I know. It's the best I could do." And I think that's a very accurate thing to say when you're basing a story off of true events, because if you aren't writing about literally yourself and your own experiences, it's hard to get the story exactly correct. So he did take some creative turns in it, but I think the story wound up being really good. The elephant and his owner, Bran, they go on all kinds of adventures, and really it's because Bran wants to be with the elephant forever, and it's they were in this circus, and then the circus was sold, which meant that the elephants were sold, and the man who was running the circus now didn't want Bran involved at all, and Bran snuck onto the ship to be with MODOK, and then the ship went through a hurricane, and it's crazy. MODOK winds up being this amazing heroic animal, and the fact that this is based on a true story really kept me going because I really wanted to know what happened. But the beginning really, really dragged on. So I did wind up giving this book a 3 out of 5 stars. If it had dragged on as much as it did in the beginning throughout the rest of the book, I probably wouldn't have given it a strong 3, but I did wind up liking it. And that is MODOK by Ralph Helfer. Next up, I read a book that was not a drawing. It was one of my 5-star predictions books. I know you're probably on the edge of your seat whether or not I gave it 5 stars, but that is The Silent Patient. The Silent Patient has been really, really hyped up lately, specifically at the end of 2019. So I have been really eager to read it. It's actually been on my shelf since it came out, so it's not like I had any excuse. I actually owned it. This book I read and I listened to, not the whole thing, but there were some parts that I was working on some computer work, and I listened to the audiobook version as well as read bits and pieces of it. I am generally not an audiobook lover, but I'm trying some new things this year, and I did wind up liking the audiobook okay. So we'll see how I progress in my audiobooks this year. But that being said, this book follows a psychotherapist who is caring for a patient who murdered her husband. And when she murdered her husband, she stopped talking. So she's in this mental facility and she is not talking at all. So the therapist is trying to get her to talk and to tell the story of what happened. I'm not going to give a lot away. This is a thriller, and I feel like if I talk too much about it, it will give too much away and then you won't enjoy the book. I did not give it 5 stars. I gave it 4, which I actually think is a little generous now that I'm thinking of it. I figured it out, and I think that that's why I am not giving it a solid 5. If I'm reading a thriller and I can figure out the twist, I don't give it a grand rating. But I did give it a 4 because I actually really like the way it's written, and I think that the hype is good. I mean, I think it lived up okay to the hype, because if you don't figure out that twist, then man, it's a doozy, but I figured it out. Maybe I've just read too many thrillers, but I did figure out the twist at the end, so I didn't give it a solid 5. A little disappointed that I didn't give it a 5, or that it didn't deserve a 5, but I'm hopeful that my next 5-star prediction book for February will be, well, 5 stars. After that, I read Starfish by Akemi Dawn Bowman. I read this on the Scribd app, so if you are a Scribd subscriber, definitely check it out. I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars, which is actually really good for a young adult novel for me. I don't generally give huge ratings to young adult novels, but this one I gave a 3. Starfish follows a character named Kiko, who is graduating high school and is desperate to go to this art school called Prism. And she is living with her mom, who is crazy. Like, this woman has serious mental health issues, and I hated her. I absolutely hated everything about her. She also lives with 2 of her 2 brothers. She suffers from debilitating social anxiety, and that is the connection I was able to make with her. Not that I am so socially anxious that I can't function, but I think everybody has some sort of social anxiety moments in their lives, and this is definitely something I was able to connect with her. But she literally cannot be in specific social situations without her friend or without someone familiar to her. And she goes to this party, which very out of character for her, and she runs into her old childhood friend who had moved away, who she is like secretly in love with. And she doesn't get into her art school, so then she becomes very dependent on her childhood friend, Jamie. Throughout all of this, she blames herself for her parents' divorce. She has some background of sexual abuse from her uncle, and her mom does not believe her, that was painful for me to read, because it's just like, how do you not believe your child? anyways, I hated that character with a passion. In the end, she does, of course, find herself, and she does find some sort of strength, and she does finally kind of accept the way things are, and she's able to move forward. So without giving a ton away, I really felt like for the majority of this book, I kept thinking, oh, this girl, like all of these problems are such high school problems. But then as you actually delve a little bit more into the story, you realize, these aren't just regular problems. Like, these are real issues that this girl is going through. And I really liked how the character handled them. One thing I also thought about was the fact that as an adult, and I'm reading this story, one of the things that stood out to me was how a child's perception of an event could be completely wrong. I mean, she blamed herself for her parents' divorce, and it had nothing to do with her. As an adult, you don't really think about a child's perspective, but they could be completely wrong about something, but that is so ingrained in them. That stood out to me and definitely had an impact on me as an adult. I don't think it would have if I had read this as a young adult, or if I had read this when I was not a mom yet. But I thought this book wound up ending very, very well. The end did not disappoint me. I really thought that it was going to go a different direction, and it didn't. So I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars, and that is Starfish by Akemi Dawn Bowman. Okay, last but not least, if you watched my January TBR video at the beginning of this month, you'll know that I had chosen The Darkest Evening of the Year by Dean Koontz as my last pet on the cover book that I drew Pluto for, my Pluto card. I hated it. I wound up DNFing this book at about 100 pages. I could not finish it. It was just not good. I really felt like, because I've read books by Dean Koontz before that I've liked, that I've been impressed by, so I was really hopeful this would be another. But I really felt like as I was reading this, that the author may have been given a deadline by a publisher and just had to rush through this story. I think the story had a lot of potential, but I just couldn't read it. It was not good at all. So I had decided to wait and see if I would like it later. So I tried it again, and I still hated it. So I went ahead and just picked another book that had a pet on the cover, and that is A Man Called Eva by Frederick Backman. I have read a book by this author before. This is a very well-known author. I read Beartown, which is the first book I've read by him, and I was not impressed with Beartown. I'm actually going to do a video in the future of books that did not live up to the hype, and I'll go ahead and give you a heads up. This book, unfortunately for me, did not live up to the hype, but A Man Called Eva, I liked. I liked it a lot. I wish this had been the first book I read by this author, because I really, really, really loved the character Uva. And I actually wanted to say Ove, because that's how I sound out words. I wanted to call him Ove. But I listened to the parts of the audiobook for this book as well, which is narrated by J.K. Simmons. So I loved the audiobook. If you have an opportunity to listen to this one as an audiobook, I recommend it. I went back and forth between reading it and listening, and I enjoyed it immensely. The book follows a character, of course, a man called Ova, who is this grumpy old man. And it goes back and forth between him in present day. This is what he's like. He's old and living without his wife and just following all of his rules. And he is just an angry, bitter, grumpy old man. But then it goes back to his past, and that explains kind of why he is the way he is. And I really liked it. I mean, one of the things that I loved the most about this book was literally the first chapter. And it is Uva buying an iPad. And he's at a Best Buy type store, and he is talking to the associate. And if you don't already know, I used to work at Best Buy a long time ago and in Geek Squad. So having this old man character, as grumpy as he is, It was so real, you guys. I chuckled that whole first chapter. So I was already in love with this character. Not even by the end of the first chapter, I was already in love with this character. So, I can agree with some Goodreads reviews that I've read that there are some sections of this book that seemed to drag on and seemed very repetitive, but I do believe that that was intentional by the author. So if you don't like that writing style, I would stay away from it. But I enjoyed this book way more than I enjoyed the other book I've read by him, which was Beartown. And I wound up giving Eva 4 out of 5 stars. All right, so there you have it, guys. I read 6 books in January, which for me is exceptional. I have my February TBR up and coming, so take a look at that when it is posted. And if you want to know when that's posted, make sure you click subscribe and ring that bell for notifications, and I will see you next time.